Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natinator, and welcome to a really amazing creepypasta. This story is titled, My Story. Now, before we begin, I want to put in a little warning that there are a few references to some trigger points in this story. So, here's your chance to leave the video if you're going to be affected by talk about heroin abuse and/or suicide. Thank you. Now, as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story begin. I'm from a small northern town in England, a place with a non-relenting gloom that surrounds the insignificance of the poor souls that live here. It always rains. The sodden clothes we wear only serve to weigh us down into an inescapable darkness, anchor us all into a depression so deep we are the only creatures living there. Life is heavy, life is unfair, life is grim. I am no exception, given life by a prostitute mother, and created in a heroin-infused womb. I was born into this God-forsaken world without a fair choice of good life. Since my backstreet birth and subsequent abandonment, I've been fighting an uphill battle just to exist. Somehow, though, I've made it through 29 birthdays. My 30th is in 2 weeks' time. Happy birthday, me. I would try and take the credit if I wanted to pretend that I was a better man. However, without my auntie Joanne, I would have succumbed to my own irrelevant existence. I would have probably slit my wrists or overdosed on the brown powder long ago. But she dragged me up, kept me in line, and kept me away from my thirst. Most heroin addicts remember a time before the itch, a time when they weren't consumed by the unconquerable desire to inject liquid paradise into their feeble bodies. Not me. I was born with it. I don't know any different, so I can't complain about how it's ruined my life, my family, or anything else that addicts think used to matter. Most users find a moment of clarity where they promise to rectify all the wrongs they've made. All of it is just self-righteous stuff that they tell themselves to make tying a belt around their arm a little bit easier. I bet my mother gently rubbed her belly, whilst I assumed the fetal position inside her warmth and whispered to me that this is the last time. It never was. She exited this mortal coil when I was 6. She died as she had lived, on her back. She was found with a needle in her arm and vomit lodged in her throat. They told me at the time that it would have been painless, that she wouldn't have felt anything. I know I was supposed to have felt some sadness at her demise. I think I pretended that I did, but to be honest, I didn't care. As I've got older, I kind of hoped she did feel anguish, and that her last thoughts were of me, of what she'd done to me. When it happened, my mother wasn't taking care of me. My auntie was. She wasn't actually related to me, but she insisted that I call her auntie, probably in an attempt to help her love me more. Her son was my mother's ex-husband. A time before my mother became an addict, she had a husband. He died in the Falklands, and my mother's life fell apart. I was born to some random guy that had paid for the pleasure, but my auntie took on the responsibility of raising me. I think sometimes she liked to pretend I was a product of the boy she had born, had loved and had lost, and not an accident created by fate on the back of sleaze. I was raised well enough. We didn't have much, but I never wanted for anything. She kept me on the straight and narrow, and her heavy hand was what kept me in check. I had nothing but resentment for a lot of my childhood, but as I grew into a man I appreciated why. She hit me with the belt, so I wouldn't use it on myself. My life so far has been somewhat unremarkable. Like a pattern on a lifeless wallpaper, I've blended into the normality of the world that envelops me. I work in a factory, have struggled to hold down a steady relationship, and until 2 months ago, lived with my auntie. 2 months already. Wow, doesn't time fly? She had taken ill in early December. It wasn't her first time battling cancer. She'd beaten the disease that had eaten away at her bowels 8 years previous. But this time, I knew the fight had gone out of her. Every time I looked into her eyes, I could see resignation. Like she had taken on God and knew she had been defeated. She'd never looked so old. She was 87, but always carried a bit of youth about her. Always an active lady, but now bedridden. The silver of her hair had started to die and disperse, and give way to patches of nakedness, surrounded by hair as mundane and grey as a rain cloud. Her false teeth had been removed, and her face had sagged considerably, the wrinkles of her face conveying her age like the inner circles of a wilting tree. Her once electric blue eyes swelled like the dark ocean in a storm. She kept talking about how tired she was, that she was ready. Ready for what I didn't know. I couldn't help thinking she meant ready for the great beyond. She wasn't religious in the slightest. I never heard her pray. She had no pictures of Christ, and she didn't keep a Bible. We didn't even talk about whether there was a God out there in the heavens above. When you have to face the stark realities of life, I suppose God doesn't exist for you. But something in the acceptance of her fate seemed to have opened a door inside, and in through it had walked a belief that this wasn't the end. I visited every day, partly out of duty, and partly out of a selfish desire to not be alone. I would sit by her bedside whilst the morphine dripped into her system to help ease her pain. The world I was harshly born into was the same one that would gently take her out, it would seem. Most of the time, she would lie there semi-conscious, muttering to herself, and I would sit in silence, watching the life fade away from her like a sunset. Every once in a while I would turn up to the hospital, and she would be sat upright in her bed, fresher than a daisy, and ready to explode with conversation. She would talk about her life, how she had hoped she'd done a good job of raising her son, and how she would see him and her husband again. As the weeks passed, these waking moments saw her become increasingly happy. She had convinced herself that her 2 boys were waiting to take her home. That takes me to the week before her death. A dark and dank Thursday afternoon, the wind serving only to throw the heavy rain into my face. A cold, hard slap from the hand of God. I didn't have any money that day. I didn't have money most days. So I walked to the hospital, and every step felt forced, like I was walking toward death itself. That's what I assumed, that my auntie had died during the morning, and that only her memory would greet me when I arrived. But what I found there was much worse. The ward she was in gave me an uneasy feel. Hospitals in general always have the feel of death hanging over them, like an umbrella blocking out the sun on a glorious summer's day. People are fighting the inevitable in hospitals. Their struggles give the feel of a constant war between the living and the cold touch of the grim reaper. That's why I believe cemeteries are more peaceful than they are frightening. The dead can't struggle anymore. The lights in the hospital ward felt dimmer, their brightness turned down, and there was an unsettling quiet that choked the atmosphere, unseen but obvious in its blanketing presence. I arrived, expecting to see an empty bed among the 5 others that filled the small room. But she was there, sat up, alert, but different. Something so different that my heart lodged itself in my throat, and fear took a hold of me like a stranger grabbing the arm of a child before dragging them away from their mother. She turned her head, slowly, so slowly. Her eyes locked forward the entire time, as if hands held her head in its place and were forcing her to look at some horrific sight. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the acid in my stomach try to rip my soul apart. Their bloodshot appearance made me think she'd been crying rivers of crimson. They peered through me, reaching my very core and tearing it to pieces with their solemnness. I wanted to run away and never go back. The skeletal face of this woman had replaced the one that I had grown to love. The woman that once cared for me now seemed like she wanted to tear my flesh from its bones. A small recognition lit in her eyes. There, but for a brief moment, but enough for me to take one step forward instead of the many steps back my animal nature told me to take. "Hello," is all I could muster. She mumbled something back. I thought it might have been help, but I couldn't be sure. It could have been a simple hello that had become lost on its way. She started to cough, viciously, the air trying to escape the black abyss of her poisoned lungs. Instinctively I darted forward to help her. I poured a glass of water, and this feeble old lady that had just scared me so was now quivering in my arms as she sipped from the glass like it was her first drink after days in the desert. There was nothing but silence for a few year-like seconds, until she gripped my hand. Such strength escaping from the brittle bones in her limb, a vice locking onto me. She tilted her body back, pulling herself away from the comfort I had given in my embrace, and looked at me. "He is coming for you," she said. The words were as clear as a piano played in an empty hall. Each letter danced cold upon my spine, sending shivers rippling across my body as a brick sends shivers in a lake. "He is coming for you," she managed again, before leaning in to take on more water. I tried to speak with clarity, showing no fear, but every letter and every word shook and trembled. "Who is coming for me?" I struggled. She suddenly sat upright, lifting her head toward mine. I flinched, expecting a new horror, but her iron grip on my hand loosened, and I saw nothing but love in her eyes. She said my name so gently, it could have taken flight. She started to sob. "What's wrong?" I almost begged to find out, but was terrified of an answer. "Nothing. I'm a silly old fool. I'm on my last legs and this morphine is making me unstable. That's all," she replied. I couldn't find the courage. It lumped in my throat, stifling my words. I found something eventually. "Who is coming for me?" "Ignore me," she almost whispered back. "Ignore me." But I couldn't. She was asleep minutes later, the morphine a lullaby, the hospital bed a cradle. She looked at peace. I must have drifted away myself, because the scream brought me back into a reality. She was flailing, contorting, and her body writhed in agony. Blood poured from her nose, and the screams shattered the dreams of the dying. I matched her cries of agony with one of my own as I called as loud as I could for a nurse. Suddenly, my auntie stopped. She laid motionless upon her bed, as still as a moment lost in time. I thought she was dead. I turned and called for a nurse again, and returned my gaze to the lifeless figure. I moved my face in close to see if I could see any signs of breathing. I could smell something that plagued my nostrils, making them sting as it was rotting meat, dried urine, raw sewage, all mixed together. No rise in the chest, no parting of the lips. It looked as if my auntie had left me here alone. I tilted my head and put my ear close to her mouth to see if I could hear any breathing, hoping to catch her last one. "He's coming for you," she whispered. I staggered back, hitting the chair I was sitting in, and fell onto the floor. She sat upright, looking straight at me. Her eyes a spider's web, my eyes the fly trapped in its doom. She was smiling. Oh, how she smiled at me. A wicked, joyous smile. She seemed to enjoy my submissive fear. Sternly the words came pouring out. "He is coming for you." The voice grew in volume. "He is coming for you." She started coughing. Phlegm and blood and pus came up with every hack. She spat at me. "He is coming for you," she howled once more. I trembled in her gaze, and could only yelp a defeated, "Who?" She snarled, "He is. At first he will make you feel like you're going crazy. You'll feel his burning eyes in the back of your head when you're alone. He will make you feel nothing but dread as you turn around to see if everything is okay. He's in the shadow, in the corner of your eye, the noise that makes you jump, the shiver that you feel when you know someone is following you. He is coming for you, and he will not make it quick. He will take you in every way you fear, and you can do nothing to stop it. He is coming for you." As I sat there, frozen on the floor, a nurse darted past me, pinning my auntie to the bed by her shoulders. My auntie resisted, but was soon overwhelmed by a second and third nurse. They gave her a shot of something, and her resistance was over. This moment is etched into me like a carving in stone, yet the moments shortly after are void of nothing. All I remember next is receiving a call a few days later to tell me that my auntie had not awoken from the coma, and that she died peacefully. I hoped she was with her boys. From then on I became reclusive, fearful that something was coming for me. I slept with the light on. What kind of adult sleeps with the light on? And what kind of man wets the bed still? The doctor I went to see told me exactly what I thought I would hear. That she was on medication, she was dying, that hallucinations and vivid dreams were not uncommon, and this could be attributed to what happened. But I couldn't accept this. There was something in her eyes that made it true. I started to fear my own shadow. I felt that every day would be my last, that every moment something, someone, would fulfill this prophetic statement given by the one who only ever truly cared for me. The nightmares were the worst part. The horror that unfolded night after night is unspeakable. He came to me every night. He was everything and everyone. A drowned little boy with a slit throat so deep his tongue fell through the gaping hole. He smiled as he castrated me with the kitchen knife, stuffing my mutilated genitals into my mouth. A limbless, fat, bald man. He was sweating, naked and clambering on the floor toward me, his stumps slowing his crawl. licking his lips as he inched closer to my paralyzed body, his erection displaying his purpose. An old man with skin that looked like it had been shrink-wrapped around his bones. He whistled as he stroked my body with his liver-spotted hands, his dirty, long fingernails caressing my stomach. I was tied down to the bed, and he reached his pocket and found a scalpel. He forced my eyes open when I closed them. The metal moved closer to the pupil until all I could see was the point of the blade. It was the closest thing to finding God that I had ever been. The fine point of a needle, my vessel to the heavens. The nightmares didn't cease, but soon they became irrelevant as my desire gave in to the warmness coursing through my body. I wanted more and more, and filled myself up time and time again. Apparently, they found me unconscious, lying in a back street. How funny that I was born on one, and tried to die on one. I was taken to hospital, the same one where my auntie died, and the nightmares returned as my thirst consumed me. He invaded my mind, and the visions were more vivid than they had ever been before. But it wasn't the actions in the nightmares that destroyed me. You see, he tortures me when he talks to me. His words are the razors that flay my skin. I begged the nurses to kill me and end my misery. They wouldn't. But I will. Today, I've checked myself out of the hospital and have refused the urge to take another hit. I sit at my laptop writing these words, with a warm bath. Yes, you could call this my suicide note, and if I don't end it now, I fear what dreams may come. Before my auntie died, she had faith that she would be greeted by her boys in the afterlife. I believe that there is nothing but darkness and emptiness and silence. Even that seems to be better than what could be coming. Even though I'm supposed to gasp in fear. It's funny how people can create such horror out of nothing. Funny to those who have really felt it, seen it, tasted it. That's not the reason for my final smile, though. The reason is because I know you're reading this. There is one thing that reassures me. One thing I've found out thanks to my nightmares. One thing he told me. One thing that makes the end seem easier. My auntie wasn't speaking to me when she said what she said. He is coming for you.